This week marks the 7th-month anniversary of the Hamas attacks against Israel that killed 1,200 Israelis. It also marks 7 months since Israel's war in Gaza started, which Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu said is set to destroy Hamas in Gaza. This war has killed 35,000 Palestinians, to date, the vast majority women and children. But also to date, more than 100 hostages taken by Hamas on October 7th are yet to return back to their families in Israel. Some of them are American citizens. This past week, Israel also started its military campaign in Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians have sought safety, having been forcefully displaced from various parts of the Gaza Strip. Hostage negotiations, sadly, have not yet yielded any breakthrough, leaving the region in a state of uncertainty, and tensions are also running high. Today, I speak with a Wilson Center former fellow, Guy Laron, who is based in Israel and is Israeli and has done a lot of research with the Wilson Center in previous years. So welcome back, Guy, to our discussion about the current situation in the region. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Marisa.
So, Guy, the situation is sort of on hold when it comes to the hostages. There's a lot happening in the ground in Israel. I wonder if you can give us a sense, just a brief overview of how you see things unfolding amongst Israeli society and amongst Israelis. We know that there will be a big protest tomorrow in Tel Aviv, for example, and then there is some disconnect with Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, but the war is still ongoing.
Right.
How do you see things?
Well, the big thing is that Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war. He refuses to issue a declaration about, that has a lot of legal implications as well, saying that Israel is no longer at war. But he sees that as a threat to his coalition, to his radical right-wing coalition. There were several centrist parties in parliament that announced that should the coalition fall apart because of a hostage deal, they'd be willing to support it, to give it a new lease of life. And that's an offer that Netanyahu is not willing to take. So it's not like he doesn't have political option. He does, but he prefers to stick with what he has. So that puts the whole situation in a deadlock. It's not just the fighting in Gaza. There's ongoing fighting in the north as well, between
with Hezbollah.
Yes, and the West Bank is simmering all the time. There was an activity of right-wing settler militia before the 7th of October, but these have only increased as far as we can observe. So the situation is boiling. There is a chance right now. What we have is basically a unity government because one of the opposition parties joined the government, but like the latest analysis from political pundits that it may be falling apart. That Benny Gantz, who you might have heard of in the news, yeah, so he would probably leave the government within the next week. That doesn't mean that Netanyahu loses his majority. He still has one. The other thing to say is that the opposition is splintered. One of the questions that the protesters in the streets ask, like continuously, is where is the opposition? They feel that they are the opposition. Of course, they're demonstrating against the government, but they don't receive the same backup from the parties they elected in the last elections. Um, as you might know, Itamar Ben-Gvir is the Minister of Police. So the police is more and more veering towards the pattern of a kind of Praetorian Guard. It, it ignores the law frequently. It arrests without due cause. It seems like it's trying to suppress the protest movement. Sometimes it arrests the leaders of the movement, when they're not even in a demonstration in their own houses. So what the demonstrators would like to see is the opposition parties standing behind them, or preferably in the front line. There are only two members of Knesset that do that from the Labour Party, but the rest of the opposition parties seem to be silent. So
why do you think that the opposition parties are not stepping up to support the protesters and those who are opposing Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Everybody seemed to think that there is a day after Netanyahu, and it's not far in the future in terms of his political future, maybe in terms of his health, but here we're just speculating and suspecting that something is off. He has been hospitalized at least twice in the last few months, and he didn't give a clear statement about his state of health. So that's another thing. And most of the opposition parties are centrist, and they believe that there's this bank of voters that hew closer to the center that they might capture if they would not be, too much upfront in their support of a ceasefire. I mean, it's not just a tactical thing. Going to a ceasefire is going to talks about long-term settlement, and any talks about a long-term settlement would be a conversation about the future of West Bank settlements. This is on the table. It is on the table in a way that it wasn't before 7th of October, and you can't remove it from the table from now on.
And this is a hot potato issue that all of these parties do not want to handle. Is that your reading of it?
Yes, leading politicians are even not willing to express the word peace anymore on TV, lest they be suspected of being too lefty or too radical. So this is where we're at.
So do you have a sense that Israeli society has been so hardened by the October 7th attacks that it becomes very difficult for political leaders to take any risks, to talk about the two-state solution, to talk about reconciliation, to talk about peace with the Palestinians?
Right.
How do you move away from that, and what does it take to move away from that?
So, yeah, that's a great question. So, two things that are important to really underline, and I think I don't see enough of that in reports from the international media, from correspondents based here in Israel. The sheer panic and fear that gripped even, educated people, tolerant people here in Israel after the 7th of October is just hard to describe. Even people that I never thought would talk like that spoke about the Arabs. They fear the Arabs in general.
In a derogatory manner, you mean?
The Arabs are a threat. Women from the center of Tel Aviv, and I live in a fairly liberal neighborhood, they were terrified because someone who looks like an Arab walked into their condo or passed in. That was a phenomenon, more of the first weeks, but it does give you a sense of how national psyche has shifted since. So that's thing number one. But thing number two is, I think, below the surface, there's a growing recognition that we're stuck, that the West Bank settlements is the main issue, that we're stuck. And I think, in a way, in saloon conversations and coffee house conversations, people are more radicalized than their leaders. They're starting to talk about things you won't hear when you're listening to Israeli mainstream media. So I think the ground is shifting. I think international pressure does have an effect, and it's subterranean. We still don't see that on the surface, but this geyser, this stream would come out at a certain point.
And having just sort of discussed the protesters, I mean, are they all protesting the same thing? Are they protesting Bibi Netanyahu because the hostages are not back yet? I mean, we've seen some of these images and footage in the media, but are they also protesting the war, or is there overwhelming support for the war?
If there was an overwhelming support for the war in the beginning, but then things went off, in the sense that there's already a majority of people that understand that if Israel doesn't want Hamas to rule Gaza, then it should say what element, what organization, what entity would rule Gaza after Hamas is pushed out of Gaza. And the fact that the prime minister refuses to allow any other element, obviously he's not willing to discuss the Palestinian Authority or Fatah as an element that would enter Gaza. So that made people suspicious. Also, those that follow the news do understand that the war basically has ended. You just said that the campaign in Rafah has started, but not in earnest. I mean, the IDF didn't do all the things it needs to do to start a campaign in Rafah. That's extremely complicated, and in any case would take several weeks. So, I mean, in terms of military activity, in like Israeli military activity in the Gaza Strip, it's fairly low profile now. I mean, you can see photos or video clips of skirmishes, but there's not a lot of the IDF inside Gaza right now. Okay, I mean, those that military pundits are saying around December, January, most of the Israeli troops were withdrawn out of Gaza. And the reason we don't talk about it more is, again, Netanyahu unwilling to end the war and declare things as they are. Now, with regard to the protesters and what they think about Bibi, so in the past few months, there were 4 protest demonstrations each Saturday, 4. 1 kilometer apart from each other. So the biggest was in front of the Kiryat. Kiryat is like the compound in Tel Aviv that includes both military headquarters and where the cabinet meets often. So that's demonstration number 1. Demonstration number 2 is another gate of the Kiryat, and this is the more radical demonstration to bring back the hostages. So the first one I described as more consensus-driven, and they would say things like, yeah, we want the hostages back, and then we'll flatten Gaza. So on the one hand, talk about bringing back the hostages, and then appealing to the nationalist sentiment.
Mhm.
The guys in Begging Gate, this is how it is known, they won't say that. They say, we want a hostage deal now at any price, at any price. They say it very clearly. Then there's a demonstration, again, a kilometer apart against Bibi specifically, calling for snap elections. And
Mhm.
then and that's the smallest demonstration, is a demonstration against the occupation, not more than 3 or 4 dozens of people. So, but that gives you, I mean, it was worth, covering the whole kind of demonstration to say that the opposition is splintered very much.
And as Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to sort of push back, this declaration that the war is about to end, are there discussions in Israel amongst the various factions about what Israel's role will be post-war? And then similarly, sort of, covering the northern front in Israel with the military clashes with Hezbollah, as well as the uptick in right-wing settler violence in the West Bank. Is there discussion on how to de-escalate in order to sort of basically start to have a more secure, peaceful conversation about reconciliation or about just the day after?
Right. So there are two visions being promoted at the same time. There's the right-wing vision. They do have a plan for the day after, and they don't want to de-escalate. They want to re-escalate.
Mm-hmm.
They want to further escalate the situation. I think their biggest problem is they don't have a good explanation of what they'll do about international pressure that will only continue to increase. Some factions of the government are typified by, well, sheer ignorance about. I mean, there are some ministers whose English isn't good. They can't consume really international news. It's not like they can open the New York Times in the morning and read the headlines. They can't.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, they have a plan on how to win, the domestic fight, and so far things are going to them for them. The war isn't ending. What the settlers are doing in the West, it's not a host of hostile acts against the Palestinians. It's a plan. It's a plan that the finance minister wrote before he was a finance minister. It is known as the resolution plan. And what it seeks, in plain English, is the ethnic cleansing that's the goal, the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. And whomever decides to stay in the West Bank, whatever Arab population survives, that will need to be docile and reconcile with the fact that they will never have civil rights. So that's and for these ministers, that includes finance minister and the police minister and several others. As far as they're concerned, the war in the south and in the north can continue indefinitely in order to cover and allow the implementation of the resolution plan. Okay, so yeah, that's a grim picture. It's not clear what they can do about the U.S. stopping arms shipments. They don't have a good explanation from where Israel would buy its weapons. They don't have a good plan for what happens if God forbid the U.S. and the European Union decide to cut Israel from the SWIFT system. Say, okay. Because international pressure is only increasing. We know that the European Union is about to recognize a Palestinian state. might happen even this month. So they have a good how their plan works in the domestic context. They don't seem to have a good vision or good plan of how their plan would work in the international context. And then, of course, left-wing parties do have a vision. Obviously, it would include, ending the war, getting into a ceasefire, working with the Palestinian Authority. That's always key. I think that most of the opposition parties would agree, can reconfigure around the vision of Israel evacuating some of the settlements. The big secret of Israeli settlement in the West Bank is basically something like 85 to 90% of Israeli settlers sit on only 6% of the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it, the rest 10 to 15%, those are isolated settlements. That's what creates most of the clashes between Jews and Arabs in the West Bank. So if you remove those, that isolated settlements, you removed most of the reasons for the ethnic strife within the West Bank. And of course, if at some point, and that's part of the left-wing vision, if Israel decides to annex those settlement blocks, those 6% of the West Bank territory that I was talking about, then Israel can also compensate the Palestinian Authority and give it territory from other regions of Israel. And then it's clear that when you deal with those issues, the Northern Front, that would settle itself.
Mm-hmm.
Hezbollah would not have a pretext
Mm-hmm.
to continue warfare along the border. And it's not talked about, but part of what causes the tension along the northern border is that Lebanon is demanding a few border adjustments of territories that it claims belongs to Lebanon. That includes the Shaba Farm.
Shabbat farms. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's not a big chunk of territory. You can easily, if you don't have a right-wing government, you can easily find a solution for that. So that would be the left-wing vision. And of course, once you do all those things, then you open up horizons like the normalization with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab world.
So it just seems that because there are these two visions, what most people are hearing in the Arab world in particular is this right-wing vision. I think they are matching what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank with this right-wing vision, with this right-wing rhetoric that's coming out primarily from the radical right-wing ministers in Bibi Netanyahu's cabinet. And I guess, again, I'll ask you, this one final question. Why aren't we hearing the other vision being talked about as well by the other more liberal, I guess peacenik is not a word that we use anymore in the lexicon we used to in the 90s, but basically those who had worked for peace and reconciliation with the Palestinians?
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me that Arab media would amplify what those right-wing ministers are saying, because they have influence. They have a lot of influence, both the finance minister and the minister of police. But the liberal forces, they're pretty fluent in English. They're very accessible, and they would include Yair Lapid, for example, who was in Washington only, the previous week. So I think Israelis are doing the same mistake. They amplify whatever Nasrallah is saying, whatever Hamas is saying, and they think that represents the Arab world. So I can see from where it's coming, but you should remember that in any poll done since the 7th of October, this particular coalition, this set of parties, they don't get a majority again, and the opposition parties they have a huge majority. If elections were taken today, the parliament would be completely flipped. So the peaceniks, so to speak, don't have an influence now, but they might have in the day after an election.
Guy Laron, thank you so much for sharing your insights. This is a fascinating discussion about where Israel's society and the political parties and the different factions are. And we hope to continue the conversation, hopefully as the war ends, the hostages return safely, and a ceasefire is in place. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.